Welcome to ePODstemology.
Epistemology. You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a podcast. Welcome all to another episode of ePODstemology. I'm Mark Fabian from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University, and my guest this week is Ben Harrell, who is a postdoc at the LGBT Policy Lab at Vanderbilt University. Ben and I go way back. I first met him in 2019 when he was a PhD student at Georgia State. He had organised a couchsurfing system for graduate students from GSU to host other graduate students visiting the American Economic Association annual meetings from abroad. What a legend! He ended up hosting me personally, and we've been in touch ever since. I'm sure you'll sense Ben's generous and empathic spirit in today's conversation, which is on the topic of discrimination. What is it? How do different social sciences study it? Why is it bad? And what can we do about it? Let's get into it. Epodstemology. Welcome, Ben Harrell, to Epodstemology.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Can you tell us a bit about what your research area is, what sort of papers you've got in the cooker, that sort of thing?
Sure. As you may have mentioned earlier, I'm a postdoc at the LGBT Policy Lab at Vanderbilt University. And just sort of broadly speaking, I am an interdisciplinary health services researcher. By training, I'm a health economist. And my areas of expertise are broadly LGBTQ, like health issues, some labor stuff. And I'm really interested in discrimination, especially discrimination against trans people. I have a NBER working paper out with my co-authors, Patrick Button, Luca Marco, David Schweckman, and Eva Dills on discrimination against trans people and access to mental health care. And we're looking at an extension of that project right now where we look at the effect of COVID-19 on discrimination. That's really interesting. And I'm working on a lot of really cool projects here in the policy lab, looking at Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, which is one of my areas of expertise on like a whole slew of queer health outcomes and things like sexual health, so HIV treatment and prevention, things like that.
Okay, super exciting. All right, well, hopefully we can circle back to a lot of those topics.
Sure, yeah.
As we go through the conversation today. So we were planning to talk about discrimination. So I guess a good place to start would be, what do we mean by discrimination?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think generally when most people think of discrimination, they think of just like differential or prejudicial treatment of a group or an individual based on characteristics. I think that's a helpful starting point. But so economists think about discrimination in a really particular way. So there's like taste-based or prejudicial discrimination and statistical discrimination. And taste-based discrimination is just the kind of discrimination that people think about when they think about discrimination. It's like you're discriminating. Discrimination. Right, yeah. Statistical discrimination is discrimination that arises out of assumptions about the distribution of characteristics among certain groups, which is what normal people and not social scientists call stereotypes.
Sure, yeah. So could you give us an example of that?
Sure, yeah. So let's take taste-based discrimination. So imagine I am a sexist and I don't believe that women should be working in my field. So I just hire men over women. And when I'm forced to hire women, because hiring women as a discriminator costs me something psychically, that cost has to be compensated in some way.
Right.
And I compensate that psychic cost by just paying them less. Right.
Yeah, right. Or being a dick to them in some way.
Or being addicted, denying them promotion. There are a lot of non-wage and hiring ways that you can discriminate against groups. Or you can also imagine housing markets where in the work of my co-author, David Schwegman at American University, you can imagine an Airbnb, like a rental housing owner not wanting to rent to a racial or ethnic minority. And we can talk about the details of this later. When I see emails that have names that I associate with racial or ethnic minorities, I just toss those emails out and don't bother responding to them. So that's taste-based discrimination. Statistical discrimination is a little bit more subtle. An economist would say, so when I'm talking about statistical and taste-based discrimination, I should back up a little bit and say, this is a theory of economic behavior that starts in the 70s with Gary Becker, and he's aiming to study initially it's labor markets, but he's aiming to study, why certain groups are treated differently. And these are the sort of two examples that he comes up with. But back to statistical discrimination, some examples of that would be, suppose I have beliefs about the distribution of people who have criminal records, right? And so I know that the average African-American male is more likely to have a criminal record than, say, the average white male, right? So when I'm looking to hire people, I suppose I want them to steal from me, right? So it is not necessary for me to have racial animus against African-American people to hire them less if I believe, based on the distribution of crime statistics in this country, that hiring an African-American male is more likely to have a criminal record. Right. So that's an example of statistical discrimination. I think a lot of people would say, and rightfully so, that between these two theories of discrimination, maybe it really doesn't matter what the motive is if the outcome is bad. Economists talk a lot about policies that have good intentions but bad outcomes, and how we should evaluate policies by their outcomes and not their intentions. Maybe the same is true about discrimination. That's a common criticism of this sort of dual way of looking at discrimination, and particularly with statistical discrimination. There's been some work that shows when you limit people's ability to discriminate statistically, they act in ways that are a bit more overtly discriminatory. Like, for instance, Amanda Agin, who's an economist at the University of Michigan, has this paper on ban the box policies. And if your listeners don't know what that is, if you've applied for a job recently, or really ever, there's typically a box on your job application that simply asks, do you have a criminal history? And you can either check yes or no. And these the ban the box laws basically ban companies from putting those on their job applications.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening when you do that is that firms who are hiring people just hire African-American males less. The problem with this that Amanda points out in her work is that the people who are, in particular, the African-American males who are applying for these jobs, are not a random draw from the distribution of African-American males in this country. And so making inferences, it's the ecological fallacy, right? Making inferences on broad statistics for a narrow group could lead to error. And it turns out that in the data, if you look in the data, the African-American males who are applying for these jobs are marginally, likely not even enough to be significant, marginally more likely than the white males to have a criminal record. So it's kind of a weird thing, right? So it's discrimination, but people aren't being explicitly racist. They have racial stereotypes, and they use those stereotypes to make decisions.
Okay, cool. I've got two follow-up questions to that. I find this distinction between prejudicial and statistical discrimination really helpful for thinking about some of the moral philosophy issues in here. And you pointed to this distinction between what is your motive or your intention and what's the outcome. And I think that's really important for, like, I guess, some of the animus in the current debate around some of these issues, particularly around how we think about structural racism.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember who I saw it on, but someone was saying recently on Twitter, because everything I see is on Twitter, that if you do something that contributes to structural racism, then it's important for people to try to engage with you or with people that behave that way by saying that contributes to structural racism, as opposed to saying you're a racist. And I think that's quite powerful from a sort of political point of view and an interpersonal relationships point of view, because when you tell someone that they're a racist, they tend to act defensively. If you tell someone that they're contributing to racism, then I think it's more of a factual claim rather than a moral claim. And then I guess you're also more likely to get them around, I guess, in some ways. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of looking at this. My prior is that society is a collaborative endeavor, and things like racism and sexism are wrong, among other reasons, but in my mind, primarily because they serve to separate both the discriminator and the object of discrimination from the larger collective, right? And so for me, I like to take a sort of restorative justice perspective on this, and that the goal of correcting bad behavior in this way should always be the restoration of the individual to the larger collective. We are alone on this earth. We only have each other. And I think it can be politically helpful for people, indeed, especially in this country, in the US, to be divisive and carve out these factions that are sort of perpetually fighting each other. But I don't see that as particularly helpful. One criticism of this way of thinking about discrimination that I've talked about, there's this really nice podcast and article on the American Economic Association website from Mario Smalls, who's a sociologist. And he has a criticism that is really poignant for me. I did my undergrad in psychology, and sort of the area of psychology was community psychology.
All right.
So in undergrad, we were sort of taught to think about things from kind of an ecological standpoint, these like the layers of an onion. And he makes the criticism that both of these theories, and really the way that empirical social scientists think about discrimination, sort of by design, centers the individual and the individual as the source of discrimination, both as the source of discrimination and as the object of discrimination. And really a lot of the most pernicious kinds of discrimination that we think of being the most damaging don't start with the individual. They start with society, they start with culture, they start with institutions. And I think the work of dismantling that, the work of dismantling the truly rough kind of discrimination that really makes the lives of, in particular, racial and ethnic minorities, gender and sexual minorities, and women, it makes their lives a whole lot worse, is not ever going to be addressed solely at the individual level. There's a community psychologist by the name of George Albee. This is off the top of my head, so I want to make sure I get it right. No mass dysfunction has ever been cured by treating the individual. And I think broadly that's true of discrimination. And I mean, candidly, the way that I study discrimination centers the individual. And one of the things that I struggle with constantly as a scientist is how can I broaden the perspective of my research more? Because, you know, there are ways of addressing discrimination that don't have to be you just saying you can't discriminate, right? But yeah, I really love what you were describing earlier. I think early noughts late noughts and early 2010s Tumblr culture would say that's calling in instead of calling out.
Oh yeah, I remember that phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. It's calling in and calling out. I do remember that period of Tumblr culture being like quite deeply toxic, and then just as it was starting to get better, Tumblr got bought, and then anyway, kind of.
And then everything migrated to Twitter, and Twitter became awful.
Awful. Yeah, really awful. Okay, well, great. So I definitely want to circle back to that individual as the source and object of discrimination and how that plays into our methods later, because I think that's a really important point. Maybe before we get to that, though, my second follow-up question, which I think you've touched on a bit already, is that it does seem to me like some of these cases of statistical discrimination are more like edge cases where they're kind of really bordering on prejudicial discrimination. So you talked about the real estate person, for example. I can definitely think of cases where people are doing that in an extremely taste-based way. And then, I mean, it's quite well established in the racial segregation literature that you can end up with racial segregation with people just following fairly benign preferences for the racial composition of their neighborhood. So indeed, if I was just teaching this earlier this year, actually, and there's a website, I'll try to link the website in the box for your episode, because it's pretty cool. It has an algorithm built into it, and you can set people's preferences for the racial composition of their neighborhood, and then like hit go, and you'll see how long it takes for people to sort. So if you have a situation where one minority actually wants quite a diverse neighborhood and another minority likes diversity but wants to be a bit closer to their own group, say they want like 65% of the neighborhood to be their own minority group, then very quickly you get a sorting where it's just monocultural neighborhoods because of the math of that situation. So that sounds more like a case of sort of no fault statistical discrimination, as it were, but it still ends up with this really quite pernicious outcome. So I guess I was wondering if you have any rules of thumb or any ideas on how we can think about where we're sort of straying close to the border between prejudicial versus statistical discrimination. I know that economics has had a bit of an internal discussion over the last 10 years or so about whether it's been too lenient on just like bad people who are prejudicial discriminators and been saying that, oh, it's all statistical. So any ideas?
Right. Man, that's so interesting. Yeah, people might want to also look at the Raj Chetty's Opportunity Atlas thing. when I was in my PhD program at Georgia State in the first year, Raj Chedikan gave a talk based on some of the opportunity insights stuff that he was doing. And he's talking about racially segregated neighborhoods. And I think to a certain extent, it is true that there are, I don't know if I would classify them as fully benign, but maybe mostly benign preferences for, maybe I want to live in neighborhoods that have easy access to my kind of grocer and my kind of restaurants and my kind of cultural experiences. And, that aggregates up and you end up having a certain degree of segregation as well. But I really don't think we can, especially when it comes to segregation, I don't want to harp on this too much because I know it was just a single example. I don't think we can discount too much the role that institutions play. Zoning, especially zoning decisions, and even minor things about the decisions over what kind of amenities go in neighborhoods, like playgrounds versus jogging paths versus just green space.
Or highways.
Exactly. We just draw a big red line across the map. I don't think we can discount those things too heavily, but I think there's a certain degree of homophily that it can be benign. There's certainly a lot in my field of health economics. There's certainly a lot of evidence that racial concordance with your healthcare provider can lead to much better health outcomes, in particular for Black and Indigenous people of color. So there's something to that, to be sure. But I think economics has this sort of tradition that treats preferences very agnostically, and not all preferences are made equal. So I'm not saying we should dismiss preferences altogether. I just think we should have a little more of a critical eye, especially about our own preferences, especially our preferences about who we think of as our people.
Yeah, that's good. That's well said. I guess as well, like the notion of rationality gets pulled in here a lot in ways that I'm sort of uncomfortable with. Whereas, so on the one hand, you want to respect that people rationally want to make money for their business, for example, something like that, and asking them to do the right thing and sacrifice their profits in order to promote social goods is maybe not a good foundation for policy making. And I guess economists are often very focused on policy making. They're like, well, if your policy is just founded on hoping people do the right thing, then it's probably not going to be an effective policy. You want to assume that people are going to behave in quite a mercenary fashion and sort of target that. At the same time, I think because of this focus, economics has been very reluctant to engage at all with the possibility that people could just be behaving immorally, and that alongside policy efforts, we could also have like cultural efforts to say, well, this is not rational behavior. It is a kind of mercenary behavior. And those are two different things.
Sure. No, I think that's a helpful distinction for sure. I have the sneaking suspicion that economists don't want to deal with the moral underpinnings of some preferences, just because it opens a can of worms that we don't have the training necessarily to deal with.
I'm very fascinated by the field of sociobiology, which a lot of economists are involved in, like notably Herb Gintis and Samuel Bowles, and like they have started to develop the kind of models where you can engage with these sort of issues, because the homophily that you mentioned before, that like fellow feeling and kind of culture, and a lot of these intersubjective institutions that we're talking about, like a lot of those are grounded in morality, and so they're kind of, it's hard to tease those things apart. But as you say, modeling that stuff is like hugely complex. So we'll leave that for another discussion. So maybe we'll move on. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think in the context of that, I think it's helpful. We can think about what makes discrimination bad or wrong to help answer some of those questions. And there are a lot of different thoughts about what makes discrimination bad or wrong. And I think the sort of vulgar, I mean vulgar in like the simplistic sense, like the vulgar reason of why discrimination is wrong is just because it treats people differently based on their characteristics. And I think there are times
control.
Especially things they can't control. And I can think of many reasons where you should discriminate on people based on their characteristics. Like there's no good reason to hire a blind driver. There's and there are lots of examples like that. Sometimes what is required of a situation, in this case a job, is and certain characteristics are mutually exclusive. I think in those cases it's okay to discriminate, because that discrimination is not unfair. I think where discrimination starts being wrong, and I think this distinction is helpful in addressing some of the things that you're talking about, is when discriminatory behavior is unfair and that it comes from some sort of factual error, epistemological error, or moral error. And also another case when it causes externalities. And so I'm sure there are other things that make discrimination wrong. Those are the two that I really hone in on, and I think could be helpful for sort of organizing the way we think about how to address it.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that is helpful for, I guess, parsing out so I mean, it's kind of leads into our next question actually on how we study discrimination, because it narrows the subject matter of what it is that you're studying when you study discrimination, because you're not looking at like, why aren't there any skinny pro wrestlers? Right. But you are interested in like, why are there so few black judges, or something like that. Right. Okay, so let's turn to that question then. So how do we study discrimination in the social sciences? And I know you wanted to bring the interdisciplinary perspectives in here because you've got this cultural psychology background, and then also mentioned the sociology earlier. So I think we're both kind of economists by training, so I hope we'll try to do a decent job of representing the suite of perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's helpful to rope in another theory of discrimination to sort of motivate this, and that's the sort of implicit bias stuff. In econ, I think that's mainly championed by folks like Bertrand and Mullainathan. And the idea there is like discrimination is arising from these sort of implicit cognitive biases that the discriminator may not even know they have, right? That's why they're called implicit. So, for example, there are these lab experiments in I believe in the 90s that Bertrand and I think Eldar Shafir may have done, where they find that in like a laboratory setting, in particular for white people, in particular for white undergrads, being shown black faces increases anxiety, right? For these specific groups. And despite sort of explicitly non-discriminatory behavior, there's still this sort of anxiety. The researchers are somewhat agnostic about the source of it or where it comes from, but it's there. And I think if we were all honest, and we all hopped over and took an IAT, an implicit association test, we might find areas of implicit bias in our own lives.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think the implicit bias test in particular is one of the sort of is kind of ground zero for the replication crisis in psychology. And I find this to be a really interesting area. It's kind of representative of a lot of the complexity in the replication crisis, because I think basically some of the studies that are in the milieu of implicit bias are really quite convincing, but it's not clear maybe entirely what they are convincing of, but you're kind of like, all right, there's something going on here, like this Bertrand de Molinethan stuff that you just mentioned. The implicit bias test is a bit spicier or a bit trickier, I think, because I don't know if people at home have taken one, so I'll just describe it briefly. Like, you're basically asked a series of kind of pairwise comparisons, like, do you associate this job more with a man or a woman? And you're asked to sort of answer it really fast. And the idea is that if you take longer to answer things associated with one or the other category that your bias is being tested for, that implies that you have an implicit bias, because you have to like think about it more. And I thought that was quite problematic, because if you are in fact, because you're testing for an implicit bias, but a lot of what these tests are used for is to test whether you're prejudiced or something like that, right? And so if you're trying really hard not to be prejudiced, and so you're very mindful in your life of making sure that you're trying to promote diversity and stuff. So like when I'm getting guests for this podcast, I'm always thinking like, oh, I have had too many straight white dudes on lately, and like I've got too many economists on, and I need to diversify and stuff, right? And so same thing when you're taking an implicit association test, even if it's hard to distinguish between whether you have an implicit association for something and whether you're just like really quite attentive on a level that goes beyond your conscious processing to be like a trigger when you see stuff that is gender coded, for example. Something in your brain tells you to freeze for a second and just really make sure that you've got this right. And so in that case, you're trying really hard not to be prejudiced, but it will come across in the implicit association test that you're actually heavily biased against women and blacks. I think that's quite problematic when you're then rolling it out in like organizational settings, and it's turning up that all these people in your office have implicit biases. And you would just say, well, okay, implicit bias, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you then infer from that these people are prejudiced and need implicit bias training and need to be like made aware of this stuff, then I think you start to run into problems.
No, I think that's completely fair. I think it's also important to note that bias is not the same as prejudice. And here's sort of the, my upbringing kind of colors a lot of the way that I think about this stuff. So for context, I grew up in rural South Georgia, in a place that was explicitly racist. And what I mean by explicitly racist is that my high school mascot was an actual Confederate general. So we were the Atkinson County High School Rebels, and our fight song was Dixie, which your listeners in America might pick up on and cringe a little bit. But so I've always come from the place of like, this is the soup that I was made in, and I have spent the entirety of my life like sort of sifting through my own internal workings and the way that I think about things, searching for bias because I know it's there because I was raised in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've come to think of it not as like this inherently evil thing, just mental shortcuts that I have to unlearn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so and I think, especially with like the implicit bias stuff, that should be the goal. It's not about shaming you. It's not about, or it shouldn't be about shaming you. It shouldn't be about labeling you.
Mm-hmm.
It should be about helping you identify a part of yourself that maybe you weren't aware of. That's this mental shortcut that you may or may not have been using.
Mm-hmm.
That you just put a pin in. I'm like, okay, I need to be aware of this. So, for instance, there's this study of Airbnb owners. We talked about it before. It's Edelman 2017. It's I believe it's an AER paper where they found pretty egregious evidence of racially discriminatory behavior on this Airbnb platform.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sufficient just to tell Airbnb that it was there for them to address it. I mean, I don't want to appeal to the moral fiber or character of companies, but I think and maybe this is my bias and Pollyanna attitude about humanity, but I think that in general, most people, when given the choice of doing what's right and what's wrong, if you let them know what's right and what's wrong, they will choose what is right. I genuinely believe most people want to behave morally.
Yeah.
And I think it's sufficient for some people just to let them know it's there.
Yeah.
And they'll take and they'll do the work they'll do some of the work to take care of it themselves. Obviously, that's not true of everyone.
I'm really struck by this whole train of thought you've had here, because it's kind of resonates with some of my own experiences, but in interesting different ways. So I went to a public school like a state school in Sydney, and in Australia, like in metropolitan areas in particular, education is heavily privatized. Like there are lots and lots of private schools, and so going to a state school is like not unusual, but it's definitely a thing. Like there are strong state school, private school identities. Anyway, in my state school, it was almost all migrants. So in a class of about 130 students, we would have had 60 Chinese students who were fully international, only about 10 sort of Anglo-Saxon background people, and the rest would have been migrants. So Jews, Russians, Eastern Europeans. I myself, my parents were refugees to Australia. I was conceived in a refugee camp, stuff like that. But obviously, my family has somewhat of an aristocratic background, so I had a lot of like cultural capital coming out of that. And some other people at my school did too. But one thing that's always stuck with me from my high school days is that we were ceaselessly racist to each other in a very casual way. It's like just a lot of the humor around the playground was racist. And I've always kind of looked back on that as being quite a constructive thing. Like it sort of broke down any residual arbitrary identification we would have had with racial groups or whatever it might be, to instead make us identify either as individuals who were part of a friendship circle or something, or just with the school. And yeah, and I guess the key thing as well was that those racial jokes, we never, I guess I can only speak for myself, but I never got the sense that anyone took those personally, or even more importantly, took them as a slight on their race, like a genuine kind of someone was hitting them with the prejudice. And then when I got to university and there was so much more kind of like rule following around what was okay and what was not okay to say, I just found that a bit lame, because I was kind of like, what matters here is the sort of the goodwill and the candor, I guess, or something like that, of the person that's making this joke. And obviously it's important who you're making it to and all that sort of thing. But that all comes into this kind of intersubjective sensitivity of what you're doing. And so I liked your saying that, sometimes you got to bring people's awareness of these things to light. But then equally, you've got to be ready for them to talk back to you and potentially recalibrate the way you think about it as well. I think sometimes. I think there's a lot of people at the moment who think they have a hammer and they're just going around smacking nails. But I think that's probably not the best attitude to have.
There's I think our experiences, you're right, they're similar but different in ways as well. The racism that I experienced in my childhood and growing up, it wasn't banter. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like what you're describing, I feel like what you're describing is just kind of like schoolyard banter that maybe is problematic, but doesn't rise to the level of being like this systemic sort of
and there's no hatred
problem. And that was I think that was different where I came from. And I think for people who have never experienced that sort of like bantery kind of ribbing each other culture, like there's a lot of stuff that's fair game when you're doing that, even if it's not like something you would do in polite society. And I think also it's helpful to like not to litigate that, but to just sort of put it on a shelf and just think about it and consider it and chew the meat and spit out the bones, so to speak. But I think that stuff sometimes can be innocuous. I think it's heavily context dependent. And it sounds
super
like
context dependent,
And it sounds like in your context that it wasn't explicitly harmful. I mean, I don't know. You know your situation better than mine. I don't know if it's something I would be comfortable in.
Sure.
But no, I get that. And I think we learn something between childhood and adulthood that can turn that stuff nasty. And that's this is something you and I have talked about before. That's an arc I saw in the like early mid 2010s with this sort of radical change in online discourse, particularly online atheist discourse, that just took a very strange turn into race realism and like in particular misogynistic and anti-feminist
gender essentialism.
Gender essentialism. But that's an interesting perspective.
Well, let's come to gender essentialism, because I think we're getting off track, but we are going to circle back to that. So,
sorry about that.
So like that was a fascinating series of exchanges, I think there. So what are these different ways of studying discrimination and prejudice?
Okay. So, I think for the empirical social scientists, in particular, the empirical, like sort of microeconomist, people in my camp, the logical place to start is in like labor studies, right? And so, the early way of thinking about this is something like an Oaxaca blinder decomposition. So where you use statistical methods to estimate wage differentials conditional on observables, observable characteristics of people in survey data, right? And in general, for most empirical microeconomists, what we're looking at is survey data or administrative data, right? And so basically what you do is you set up this regression where your outcome is this wage differential and your inputs are, all these observable characteristics, and you estimate your regression, and the classic sort of anti-gender wage gap thing, for instance, is to say, well, look, there's no, everyone says women earn less than men, but when you estimate this regression, we find that there's no wage differential.
Because you're controlling for industry and
Yeah.
childs.
You're in particular, in a lot of these regressions, the sort of the statement that a lot of the more culturally conservative people will say is, oh well, when you control for occupational choice, the gender wage gap goes away, and that sounds very mathy and scientific, and
it's
proper.
Also false.
It's absolutely false, and roughly equivalent to saying, in an estimation of, in an estimation of early mortality, when you control for lung cancer, there's no effect of smoking on early mortality. Well, lung cancer is the channel by which smoking affects early mortality, in the same way that occupational choice is one of the channels through which gender discrimination affects wages for women. Udea Pearl talks about this in his book on causal inference. It's a collider bias, right? Occupational choice is a collider variable. It's also an outcome, right? You're conditioning on an outcome, which is not great statistics. There's a one of the great Twitter pedagogues on this is Matthew Darlinger, Best Trousers on Twitter, who does who famously sort of eviscerated Ben Shapiro on this stuff in both on Reddit and on Twitter.
And so in simple terms, the idea is that part of the reason why women aren't in finance is because finance discriminates against women. And so women choose to not select into finance in the first place. So if you're saying, well, controlling for the fact that there's not a lot of women in finance and finance is highly paid, there's no gender wage gap. But like the idea is, in a sense, like discrimination is prior to selection into your survey. Yeah, is that?
That's one channel. And then another channel too is just like culture. Like this is changing, but for a really long time, women, I forget the research on this, but there's been previous research on sort of academic advisement in undergrad major choices that just are obviously pushing women into low-paying fields. And when I say pushing, like encouraging them to major in things that have been called perhaps disparagingly pink collar jobs. I remember studying industrial psychology and sort of the human resources side of stuff in undergrad, and hearing HR being called the Velvet Grotto because it was occupied almost exclusively by homosexual men. And women.
Yeah.
So that stuff exists. There's my colleague Mike Martell at Bard College has this really interesting research. Speaking of gay men, is this really interesting research that queer people select into majors that channel into jobs they perceive to be less discriminatory, right? And those jobs often are lower paying than things like finance or engineering or STEM more broadly.
Sure.
Which I think, so that choice definitely plays into that. But yeah, so we have these multivariate regressions, and you have to be very careful in the ways that you select the observables on which you condition. I think of Claudia Golden talks a lot about this in her work, especially on her work on the gender wage gap. And so, it can be hard to empirically test discrimination with retrospective studies of administrative survey data. So what other social scientists do, what my co-authors do, they're in experiments. Sometimes those experiments are in the lab. People do like vignette studies or these other different kinds of lab experiments. You know, we may worry that those have kind of low external validity. You know, we're not sure to what extent those generalize to the real world. But you know, what myself and my co-authors do are field experiments. So I think the sort of canonical example of this is the Bertrand and Mulley-Nathan paper, Are Lakeisha and Jamal less employable?
The fake CVs one,
Yeah. So the idea there is these are called resume correspondence studies. So basically, what researchers do is send two virtually identical resumes, but they experimentally vary the names on these resumes. One name is coded to be African American. So, for instance, if I asked the average person in the United States what racial background they thought someone named Lakeisha Washington had, they would say African American.
Yeah,
because as it turns out, the names that we give our children tend to be highly racialized.
Yeah.
And not just racialized, they hold information about all sorts of stuff, like socioeconomic status in particular. And so what Bertrand and Mulley-Nathan find is that people with Black sounding names get fewer callbacks than people with white sounding names. And then sociologists like Michael Gaddis have come along and suggested ways in which we can better account for the latent information that we don't think about other than race that is in these names, and made those better. So in the research I've done with my colleagues, what we do is we reach out to mental health providers, so psychologists, therapists, and psychiatrists, and we say, you know, hey, we're looking for. I'm looking for an appointment. I'm having a hard time with this particular mental health issue. Do you have any appointments available? And so we vary not only race, but gender identity. So we will disclose to these psychologists that these fictitious patients that we have are transgender and non-binary, or we don't mention gender status at all. And we just leave it to these psychologists to assume that they're cisgendered. And we find evidence of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities and trans people, but in particular, trans people who are also racial and ethnic minorities. Yeah, okay. So, you know, sort of this idea of intersectionality, right? There are these linked kinds of oppressions that we can experience. So yeah, we've found some interesting stuff there, folks. Folks who are listening can read our NBR working paper to see what we find if they're interested. But that's another way of studying discrimination. The persistent problem, though, that I want to point out, even with my own research, like there's hands on the table, we are still centering the experience of the individual here.
Yeah.
The individual is being considered as the discriminator, and the individual is being centered as the object of discrimination. And the truth is, like, I really cannot emphasize enough how much this needs to be driven home. The engine that drives some of this stuff isn't individualistic. It's institutional, it's cultural, it's part of these much broader things that we're all involved with. And I caution folks who are interested in studying discrimination I include myself in this, to think more about the institutions that drive a lot of this discriminatory behavior. It's not sufficient just to see that it's there. You can listen to racial and ethnic minorities and gender and sexual minorities and women, and they can tell you that it's there. I think it's helpful to quantify to the extent to which it's there, but it's not sufficient just to know it's there. We need to think more deeply about why it's there and how the ways in which the channels by which it occurs, because that stuff is important for policy.
And this is, I guess, the kind of the wheelhouse of sociology and law and political science, right? And my understanding is that what you're describing there is essentially what critical race theory was originally about, regardless of what you think it is today about. Because my understanding is that started as a branch of legal scholarship, particularly interested in medical stuff, and it was a lot of their research was based on legislation, which is kind of like institutions. Okay, well, so let's move on to slightly more optimistic territory then.
Please, yes.
So I think we've got about 5 minutes left or so. If we were thinking about what sort of policy might be helpful. So we've talked, I guess, unexpectedly quite a lot in this podcast about what sort of stances towards interpersonal relationships could improve these things. But if we're now thinking about policy, how should we think about policy design to improve discrimination? So you mentioned a few examples earlier where well-intentioned policy actually had perverse outcomes, like the opposite of the outcome that we wanted. And I think that can often happen as well with a lot of these workplace training programs. We sort of discussed that a bit too. So what are some more promising avenues?
So the way that I teach my students to think about this is that the policymaker has a lot of levers. And these levers can be categorized sort of into two groups, right? There's direct policy and indirect policy. So a direct policy, it's something like, it is now illegal to discriminate against X group, right? The problem with that is it's not. So for instance, going back to the study with my co-authors I mentioned earlier, it's illegal to discriminate. Under the Affordable Care Act, it's illegal to discriminate against against anyone on the basis of their gender identity. But we see evidence of discriminatory behavior. That doesn't mean that the mental health care professionals on the other end of the emails that we send are, twirling their mustaches thinking about excluding trans people. Some of these people might be having genuinely helpful thoughts like, maybe I'm not qualified to help this person. Maybe I don't have the training to help this person. I want this person to be helped, but I can't help them. And that leads to a transgender or non-binary person not getting a mental health appointment, which is a bad outcome. But the input of that from the individual wasn't badly intentioned. So I think you have to be very careful with direct policy. For instance, affirmative action gets, kind of lambasted by more cultural conservatives as being wrong or unfair because it treats people differently based on observable characteristics, which is, as I said earlier, is the vulgar definition of discrimination. It's like it's positive discrimination against people of color. But I could be wrong, but I think the vast consensus of research is that affirmative action broadly has been good for reducing disparities. Here's like a micro level policy that I think is really effective. A friend of mine used to work for a somewhat well-known think tank in New York, and they had a diversity problem in their staff. You know what they did? They just started recruiting at HBCUs. Sometimes it's not complicated. Sometimes the simple choice is the easiest.
I remember listening to a preliminary presentation on some big RCT they have going in a lot of the US universities around just really quite small efforts to retain women. So there's a problem with a lot of women start economics, but they drop out after the first year. And it's quite weird because like men, it doesn't seem to be just that their grades are low. So guys who have similarly low grades stick with economics, whereas women say, oh, this is not for me, and they drop out. And so there are a range of efforts that are just things like having mixers at the start of the year that are, even if they're not exclusive to women, but often they're exclusive to women, but just like specifically telling women to turn up to the mixer and then having the female senior staff there to say like economics is a thing that women can do and that sort of stuff. And as I understand it, this has shown quite remarkable outcomes, just kind of sending a strong signal that, you know, this is a place where you're welcome and you will thrive here. And also communicating to people that economics is just like quite hard is another weird thing. But yeah, anyway, so that's something.
That's really cool. I think, you know, I don't think the end goal is for everything to be exactly equal for everyone. Like every economics program needs to have exactly 50% of the students be women or exactly 50% of the students be men. You know, different people have different preferences and that's fine. But some of the disparities that we see are the result of inertia. And I think it's a mistake to think of that inertia in an agnostic way. Like it's just
it's got to wait.
Yeah. Am I thinking? Maybe I'm getting this wrong. Isn't like the naturalist fallacy or something like it? Like just just because something exists does not mean that it is natural. But going back to policy, I talked about direct policy. I don't want to understate the importance of indirect policy as well. We were talking about statistical discrimination earlier and beliefs about the distribution of certain characteristics. By using indirect policy, like in general, anti-poverty policy is going to, well-crafted anti-poverty policy. For instance, Andrew Goodman-Bacon just had a paper in the AER about the effectiveness of Medicaid across the lifetime of the program. It's been broadly effective. That improves outcomes in ways that narrow disparities, that update beliefs about the distribution of characteristics. So you can address statistical discrimination in an indirect way just by narrowing disparities with well-crafted policy, either health policy, anti-poverty policy. There's a whole suite of things you can do. The issue with that is it's slow. It's not sexy. It's not going to win you any elections, but over the long run, it improves outcomes for ways in ways that may even change culture.
Wonderful. All right, I think that's a really good place to stop. Finishing on a positive note. All right, thanks very much, Ben. That was a really wonderful conversation. I enjoyed that a lot. I hope we'll speak to you as well.
I really appreciate you having me on to talk about something that I'm very passionate about.
Awesome. Thanks, dude. I'll see you later.
All right, talk soon.
ePODstemology?
If you enjoyed today's discussion, do check out ePODstemology's page at your favorite podcast directory for more episodes on topics as diverse as tax policy and the meaning of life.